For a lot of these people, mass migration is a kind of revenge, civilizational revenge fantasy. They see it as a kind of decolonialism. They see it as a recolonization of the global north, of the West, by the formerly colonized subjects. And that's why you hear this language invoked.
Donald Trump recently had an argument with the President of Colombia over deportation flights, and it seems that he's won that dispute. What do you think this says about the Trump administration as compared to previous Republican presidents?
It's a decisive victory. And it's a victory that America could have won with pretty much any Central or South American country on this issue or on any other issue if it had actually been willing to exercise strength in the way that we have. I mean, it was a real sort of shock and awe, immediate, no hesitation response to this refusal to accept repatriation flights from Colombia. The Colombians, and this is true of South and Central American leaders across the board, stamp their feet, make all these sort of morally indignant sounds about humanitarianism and human rights, et cetera. But in reality, what it's about for all of these countries is the fact that they're making an enormous amount of money off of illegal immigration into the U.S. A substantial portion of all of these countries' GDP is remittances, which is money that immigrants in the U.S. send home to these countries. So they're obviously upset about losing their cash cow up north, but because we are so much more powerful than they are, the prospect of visa freezes and sanctions and all the things that Trump dangled in front of their face is enough to bring them to heel if we're actually willing to exercise it.
What do you think it says about these South American and Central American countries that they're so desperate not to have their own citizens return to their country? Like Haiti's president, or I don't think it's president, but the person in charge of Haiti was very concerned about Haitians returning back to from the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question answers itself, right? It says something about the character of the people coming here from those countries. I mean, one of the sort of most brazen examples of this is in Venezuela. The government of Venezuela basically emptied their prisons into the United States. It's a slightly more complicated process than that, but it's essentially what happened. They released, because they're a sort of hostile power and also they didn't want to have to deal with housing these people themselves, they released the contents of their most violent criminal population into the U.S. The U.S. started having some serious problems with Venezuelan gangs, and violent crime in Venezuela plummeted. It was a pretty remarkable thing. During the Biden era, violent crime in Venezuela went down substantially, while, surprise, surprise, violent crime related to Venezuelan gangs in the U.S. went up substantially. So it's a one-to-one sort of process, and that's true of any number of these countries. So they have an economic incentive to have their people stay here, but they also have, in many cases, a kind of social order incentive, because they send their criminals here. It's our problem now.
What did you make of this statement that the President of Colombia put out before he backed down on his threats not to have these deportation flights? And he mentioned some very bizarre things about slavery and colonialism and basically supporting Noam Chomsky and black culture in the United States. What do you make of this bizarre statement?
This is something that you've heard from Latin American and Central American leaders for decades, and it underscores the fact that for a lot of these people, mass migration is a kind of revenge, civilizational revenge fantasy. It sounds extreme when you say it in those terms, in that stark of language, but you get into any argument about mass immigration with a supporter of mass immigration, and eventually that is where the conversation ends up. Well, you did colonialism to South America. Well, white supremacy. Well, slavery, Native Americans, et cetera. Any argument about mass immigration goes on long enough, that's eventually where it ends up. So for a lot of these people, they see it as a kind of decolonialism. They see it as a recolonization of the global north, of the West, by the formerly colonized subjects. And that's why you hear this language invoked anytime there's any effort by Western nations to secure their borders. So when you understand it in those terms, it makes the conflict over mass immigration much more existential. This is not actually about people, huddled masses yearning to be free, desperate to sort of get into America because they believe in freedom. For a lot of them, it's either raw economic incentive or it's actually something much darker than that.
There are reports that Donald Trump is unhappy with the numbers of mass deportations that have happened in the first week. If you sort of extrapolate, I think they've had something like 600 a day or something like that. And if you extrapolate those numbers over the next 4 years, you get about 800,000 people being deported, which is nowhere near, the 8 million or 10 million that was promised came under illegal migrants who came under or came into the United States under Joe Biden. Do you hope or expect that these deportations will ramp up over the next weeks and months?
I do hope, and I also do expect that they'll ramp up. I could be wrong, knock on wood, but that was a concern in the first week, right? That there were only hundreds getting deported per day, and that it was going to take something like 91 years at that level to deport just the illegals that came in under Biden. There was a report yesterday in the Washington Post that the Trump administration is now setting a quota of 1,500 deportations per day for ICE and for DHS, which obviously is a transformative increase, right? If you're deporting 1,500 per day, I haven't done the math, but you get a lot closer, at least to the goal of getting at least the illegal population that came in under Biden out by the end of the resolution of the Trump term. So I think there's probably a lot of structural stuff where they have to ramp up, get ICE the resources they need, et cetera. So the optimistic read, but I think it's a realistic read, is that this was sort of the ramping up process, and we are going to see a substantial increase in deportations in the coming weeks.
Now, we've already seen attempts by the media to use empathy and kind of emotive cases to try and criticize Trump and J.D. Vance in an interview recently. Do you think that these attempts will work as we see more cases of people being deported? They say migrants are being separated from their families and children are being separated from their parents. And this is a very cruel policy that's kind of pseudo-fascist. Do you think the media's emotive arguments will sort of take hold with American people?
I think eventually they will have an effect. Absolutely. I mean, Trump is coming in with public support for mass deportations at all-time highs, which is not surprising if you've followed the spectacle at the border over the last few years. That invariably is not going to last forever, right? Once the media kind of kicks into gear, they find the sympathetic, grandmother who's been here for 20 years crying as she's separated from her child, right? That you find the maximally sympathetic sort of case, and then that becomes the story and the face of mass deportations for months, right? People who are familiar with how the media works in the UK as well are familiar with how this game goes. So that does have an effect on people who might have supported deportations because things got so bad they lose their stomach for it. With that being said, it's one of the reasons that this kind of early shock and awe campaign is so important, because you do have to sort of front load the deportations process. Because it's true, like in 2 years' time, Democrats retake the House or something like that, it becomes more difficult. People have lost their stomach for it. So you do have to be really aggressive at the start. And the Trump administration has done a pretty good job of that, with the exception of the low deportation numbers, which I think are going to get ameliorated if the reporting is anything to go by. They have been extraordinarily aggressive in this first week. And I think when there is no hesitation, when they're just executing on that, it makes it easier for people to kind of go along with it.
Republicans in the past have been very strong on the rhetoric around illegal migration and the border and so on. But when they actually get into power, the reality is quite different. And you could even argue that in Trump's first term, he wasn't, illegal crossings went down, but the border wall didn't get much funding, and it wasn't, deportations weren't, as the best they could be. Do you think this is do you see in the first week quite a different experience from previous Republican administrations, that this administration really believes or means what it said in the campaign, particularly to do with illegal migration?
Undoubtedly. I mean, this has been the most right-wing first week of any president in modern history, right? This might be the first Republican president who actually governs the way he ran in a primary. The other difference is, no government is above reproach. I think, even Trump would admit he probably made mistakes in his first term. But a substantial reason why, for example, the border wall didn't get built is A, because of five-alarm fire, unprecedented institutional opposition to him from every single institution in American life, which you really haven't seen this time. You haven't seen the mass mobilization of Antifa or the Women's March. Even the media coverage has been relatively muted compared certainly to his first week last time. And secondly, because he was getting undermined and stabbed in the back constantly by his own party. You had all of these Republicans in Congress and in his own administration who hated Trump, hated his message, and wanted to undermine him at every turn. Those elements, they still exist, but even the ones that still exist have largely been brought to heel. Trump is the undisputed leader of the Republican Party now in a way that was not at all decided during his first term. And a lot of the people who were kind of never Trumpers have either left Congress or become Democrats, talking heads on MSNBC, et cetera, right? So he really has had the time now to refashion the entire party in his image. And he has been sort of normalized in America. He's seen as less of a radical figure now. People are used to him. It's less of a shock to the system. So he can be much more aggressive now, and he has the support of his party. He has a much more on-board administration, and even his ostensible opponents have not been able to muster the kind of hysteria and hysterical opposition that they were during the first term.
I was interested in this State Department tweet that said the era of mass immigration is over. The State Department will no longer support mass migration. Now, to me, reading that, it was unclear whether that was directed at illegal or legal migration. And there's been a lot of controversy over Christmas during the transition period to do with people like Vivek and Elon Musk supporting H-1B visa, particularly of Indians, and sort of supporting essentially legal mass migration. And Trump even has been very supportive of that in the past. You know, he comes from this Democrat New York perspective on immigration. Are you concerned about, legal migration? We all talk about deportations and the southern border, but what about legal migration?
Well, obviously I'm concerned about it. And I think the fact that Republicans are talking about mass migration now rather than just illegal immigration it's a subtle but pretty significant rhetorical shift in the framing. You're talking about the institution of mass migration in general. There are too many people coming into the country, period, right? It's not illegal immigration bad, legal immigration good, which was the line from Republicans, even like the hardliners, for a very long time. So that alone is a indicative of a major shift. The legal immigration debate, the H-1B debate, that is a debate that's going to happen. There are still divisions in the coalition, and you have the introduction of these new kind of tech guys who are very gung-ho on H-1B. It's a major priority for them to lift the per-country cap, increase the number of H-1Bs, et cetera. Obviously problematic for those of us who are nationalists and immigration restrictionists. But the restrictionist nationalist wing, along with MAGA itself, is more powerful now, not just in the GOP, but in American politics, than it has been in my lifetime, probably much longer. And so far, at least, they're winning, right? Regardless of, you can sort of read into a statement from Trump here or not. He did reduce H-1Bs in his first term. And in 2016, he ran against H-1Bs. And I think if you look at the sort of approach to immigration from the administration in the first week, it's pretty clear that it's Stephen Miller who's running the agenda, not Elon Musk. And I think that's a reason for optimism.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the GBN America YouTube channel.